Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I apparently can't see you, but I'm glad you're here. I'm Debbie Schmeeding. I'm the Voter Services Chair for the State Board for the League of Women Voters. And you are part of a series that's being presented between the Voter Services Committee and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the State Board. We are undertaking to bring voter services members across the state information about reaching out to underserved voters. And if you haven't seen it or weren't there, our YouTube site has got a recording of the first session we did, which is about reaching out to voters with disabilities. And then another one, which was working with folks who are voting from jail. And today, I'm really excited. This is the real feel-good one for me. Supporting new citizens at naturalization ceremonies and all the issues around immigration and how to reach voters, potential voters who have just gotten their citizenship. We are not going to be able to touch on all the issues of immigration and immigration policy, but we have some great panelists with us here today. We have Tala Dahbour, who's a staff attorney for the Ohio chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Welcome, Tala, great to have you. And then second, we're going to hear from Belen de Leon, who is the program coordinator of leadership and social justice for the Columbus YWCA and a colleague of mine on the state board, which is delightful for me. And Linda Miltner, who is from the Greater Cincinnati League and has been very involved with participation in naturalization services in Southwest Ohio. And she did a wonderful presentation for our voter services call. So some of you may have heard from her already. But let's get started. And Tala, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Debbie. And I just want to say good afternoon to everyone who is on the call. As you mentioned, I'm staff attorney with the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a civil rights and advocacy organization. And it is the Ohio chapter. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that you all can see my presentation, and then we can get started. All right. See if I can move some things aside here. Okay. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So as the title suggests, this presentation is going to be a brief overview of the history of immigration policy in the United States. And you might notice some ever-present themes that still hold true today. And we're gonna, end the presentation talking about the population that you're gonna be working with in your registration efforts. So here we go. And also, I just want to clarify that I'm not a historian, but I hope that today's presentation adds to your general understanding of our immigration system. All right, so it wouldn't be right to speak about immigration to the United States without first acknowledging the indigenous population that existed here before any of the early European settlers came. And so this is just really to emphasize that this land wasn't an empty land. It was full of many diverse established societies before the immigration period that we're going to be discussing today. And so this graphic is just very helpful in seeing kind of how the slow erosion of Native American lands happened over time. And that's just a visual representation of that. Okay, so starting with those early European settlers at the beginning of immigration to this land, it was led by the Spanish and French, and they were followed by many European immigrants who came seeking economic opportunity and to be free from persecution, specifically during those days, to be free from religious persecution. It's also important to acknowledge that during the 17th and 19th century, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to this country against their will. And in the early to mid 1800s, we have a major wave of Irish immigrants who experienced a massive famine, and millions of German immigrants who arrived due to political unrest and economic hardship. And during those days, immigration was relatively unregulated. It was really up to the individual states to determine their own policies. And this occurred up until the opening of Ellis Island in 1892, which was the country's first federal immigration center, pictured on the slide here. And it's also extremely important to note that you could only become a naturalized citizen if you were considered a free white person. And at that time, this excluded women and indentured servants. And it was codified into law in 1790. And that racial restriction continued to be the law until 1952. And this is something that, this history is something that we still live with today, and relates to my experience as somebody of Middle Eastern descent who, when I fill out official forms, I check white. And the reason for that, it goes back to this law. So the earliest Arab immigrants came at the turn of the 20th century and basically fought in court to be considered white so that they could become naturalized citizens. And so that's why today I check white on official forms, because the early Arabs wanted to have the privileges that came with becoming an American citizen, so they fought to be considered white. And that has obviously changed over the years, but it's just an interesting piece of history to think about, and something that relates directly to me. All right, and so during the mid 1800s, you had a large number of East Asian immigrants settling in the United States, and they worked predominantly as laborers on plantations. They're driven here due to economic hardship, droughts, floods, and the California gold rush. So that brought a lot of Chinese immigrants at the time, and they were in demand for the cheap labor that they were willing to provide. And that created a lot of conflict and tension between the existing population here, worried about the jobs, and this really created a conversation about racial purity in the country. And this became a political platform that many Americans identified with, and ran elections on this platform and this idea of racial purity and anti-immigration. And so that conflict led to the first significant federal legislation restricting immigration, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this banned Chinese immigration and prevented them from becoming citizens. And this law was enforced until 1943, even though at that time, the Chinese population was only 0.002% of the total national population. So into the 20th century, there was what is known as the Great Wave, which saw a huge influx in European immigrants. And by 1910, they made up about 70% of immigrants entering the country. And the reasons for immigrating remained consistent with their predecessors: escaping persecution and seeking economic opportunity. And World War I did slow those numbers, but then it continued to pick back up after the war. So in 1924, the quota system was officially established, and basically this law restricted entry for immigrants to only 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in America as of the 1890 census. So, for example, if according to the 1890 census, there were only 100 Korean immigrants in the US at the time, this law meant that only 2 could immigrate per year to maintain those proportions, those percentages, and really to maintain, U.S. homogeneity or whiteness. Because you can see this is a law that obviously favors certain groups over others. And you can see on the slide here is a New York Times picture from that time, and the headline, "America of the Melting Pot Comes to an End." So moving in time, we had millions of Mexican immigrants arriving to work as short-term agricultural laborers to fill in the labor shortage caused by World War II. And the short-term contracts were basically created out of a similar tension between Americans and Mexican immigrants, and the constant fear that was being the constant fear of jobs and the shortage of jobs between the U.S. citizens and the Mexican immigrants. And I think that's a theme that remains consistent in our political system today. And jumping ahead, another significant piece of immigration legislation is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, where the quota-based system was finally put to rest, and the system moved towards family reunification, allowing Americans to sponsor their relatives to come. And this definitely led to a huge shift in immigration patterns from mostly European to majority Asian and Latin American. And the new legislation implemented a preference system for skilled immigrants. And the Cold War also was a huge driver in immigration from places like Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, because there was a lot of proxy warfare happening. It placed a lot of responsibility on the U.S. to be accommodating to those who were fleeing communism. And the U.S. at that time being the foremost global superpower against communism. All right, and so President Jimmy Carter established the refugee ceiling through the Refugee Act of 1890, which is something that we also still hear talked about today, and a point of contention and controversy in our political sphere. And the Immigration Act of 1990 delineated 3 distinct categories of immigrant visas: family-sponsored, employment-based, and diversity immigration. Immigrants who essentially apply through a lottery system and just happen, to get lucky. And those 3 paths are the main paths for many of the new Americans that you'll be interacting with in your work. Okay, so what's interesting is I think you'll find those root causes for immigrating to remain the same throughout history and till today, which is safety from war, natural disasters, seeking economic opportunity, and just persecution for certain social identities that people may hold, and also family separation. And here is a breakdown of the percentages of new Americans and how they came to be new Americans. So you can see the top 2 there are family related. So they would come through family sponsorship from another US citizen. And then their third there is refugees and asylees. And then it would be employment preferences and diversity and so on and so forth. And so those are the top categories for the people that you'll be interacting with in your work. And here are just some statistics to show where the majority of new Americans are coming from. And it's not exactly the most recent information, but on the left there, it's showing the percentage of refugees by country in 2016. And as you know, many new Americans start out as refugees, and asylees. And on the right there is the percentage of new Americans by country. Obviously this tends to change year to year, but you can see the trend of it largely being from Asia and Latin America. That concludes everything I have information-wise on the slides here. So I hope this was helpful in just kind of broadening your understanding of the immigration system in general and kind of picking up on those main themes that have existed since the start of immigration. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you.
Thank you, Tala. We'll have time for questions at the end, and I hope maybe at that point you could circle back and tell us a little bit about your organization and its work.
Absolutely, yes.
So yeah, but maybe right now we'll move on to Belen, who is with the Columbus YWCA and also represents so much more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I'm so excited that Voter Services is having these conversations. It's just really exciting to hear. And thank you so much, Tala, for that comprehensive history on immigration. Always super interesting to trace back that lineage and to understand kind of the background and foundations of our nation's immigration laws and how they affect and impact immigrants today. So just to introduce myself, my name is Belen. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm currently a program coordinator with the YWCA of Columbus in their Leadership and Social Justice Department. I also have a background in working with diverse immigrant populations. I've worked with undocumented students in the past. I've worked largely with asylee populations and VAWA petitioners, which, if you're not familiar, VAWA is essentially an act that protects women who have been in domestic abuse situations or have had some sort of crime occur to them, and allows them to then pursue a pathway to citizenship. And I have also worked with refugee and new American populations through the International Rescue Committee in Atlanta and CRIS in Dublin. And I'm also an immigrant myself. I'm actually a DACA holder, meaning that I benefited from the 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act, which was essentially a law allowing children of undocumented immigrants to defer their deportation and to also have access to employment authorization. And so I also wanted to note that my presentation is not working today, so we will just have to muddle through, and I will just try to make this as conversational as possible. But given my background and my experience as an immigrant, I'm just really passionate about the subject. And I also think that it's really important to understand that history, like Tala was talking about, and really understand just the incredible barriers and disenfranchisement that immigrants face today. So like Tala was discussing with history, I think it's just really important to reemphasize that the United States was really built on a foundation of open immigration for Northern European people, but really the subordination and exclusion of enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and eventually immigrants throughout the world. Despite this, actually non-citizenship and voting rights have not always been mutually exclusive. Like Tala was discussing, it was not always super criminalized. So back, because in this country, we have the mantra of no taxation without representation, and that was a rallying cry for revolution. It wasn't really far-fetched in 1776, from 1776 to 1926, to think that non-citizens who pay taxes should have the right to vote. So at the time, it was kind of common sense that the government should rest on the consent of the governed, and so non-citizens actually had the right to vote and hold office. And I say all that just to emphasize that the idea that non-citizens should have the right to vote is actually older and was practiced longer than the idea that they shouldn't. So despite these historical precedents, immigration laws in this country have, as Tala discussed, really been about preserving whiteness and have blatantly favored European immigrants while withholding citizenship rights from indigenous people, Black Americans, and by criminalizing Asian American and Latin American immigration. As Tala kind of discussed, and as you can see from today's kind of political rhetoric, immigration from non-European countries has really long been viewed in America as this really destabilizing and dangerous force, which really justifies then the criminalization of non-white immigrants into this country. And that's still pretty much a theme of our politics today. So today, with our extremely restricted pathways to citizenship, a lot of our non-citizens are really disempowered and disenfranchised. And I think it's important to look at this issue from a racial justice lens and to understand that most of the people who are disempowered and disenfranchised in this way are people of color. When we think about TPS holders, which is temporary protection status, documented immigrants, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants, which are people like me and my family who have been in this country for over 20 years and pay our taxes, and are still subject to the laws of the land, we still do not have representation or the right to vote. So I think that this is really important to consider when we're looking at the landscape of voting rights today and when we're examining immigration and the role of citizenship. So even when we look at new American populations who are eligible for naturalization, the path to the ballot box is not simple, right? Like there's so many barriers to getting there. So I mostly worked with newly arrived populations, and when refugee populations first get to this country, obviously it's the main priority is settling, right? It's learning the language. It's often getting kids registered in schools. It's figuring out where we're going to live. It's figuring out food resources, jobs, that sort of thing. So there's not necessarily, when you first arrive, an immediate desire or even really thought about voting. But that's not to say that new Americans are not passionate about voting. Actually, studies show that they're incredibly passionate and excited about the vote. A lot of our new Americans are coming from countries where they may not have necessarily had a voice or even been able to voice how they wanted their country to be run, let alone vote. So the idea of making their voice heard is super empowering for a lot of our new American communities. And it really helps these communities feel really integrated into the country that they've settled in and feel like they're actually a part of the community. But it's still a very difficult process. So first, new Americans of refugee populations have to live in the US for 5 years before they can apply to citizenship. And this 6-step process includes background checks, interviews, an exam focused on American history and government, and then finally, you just take an oath to the United States. And this process in and of itself can be a barrier. It's expensive. It's about, I think, $725. And while that may not be a lot to you, for people who are working and living paycheck to paycheck, and for people who may not necessarily have a lot of leisure time to study for this difficult exam or to practice their language skills, it's a really intimidating process, right? So that alone can be somewhat of a barrier, but even after new Americans go through this process and become citizens, they still have to register to vote. So in some states, there's actually a waiting period. After a person becomes a citizen, they have to wait for a few months until they're allowed to vote. Sometimes it's 1 month, but there is a waiting period. And the United States, I think it's important to note, is actually one of the few democracies in the world that still requires voting registration rather than just automatically registering voters. So this process of registration is actually one of the biggest barriers for our new American voters. It can be really oppressive in the fact that it's really complicated and really intimidating. And actually the biggest gap, there's still a big gap between voter participation of native-born Americans and naturalized Americans, but this gap is actually almost the same as the gap between voter registration rates between these two populations. So what we've kind of noticed is that voter registration is kind of one of the biggest hurdles to voting, because after that hurdle is passed, new Americans tend to vote in, nearly the same rates as native-born Americans. So it is really this voter registration piece that poses a really big obstacle. And a lot of new American populations cite structural barriers to voter registration, such as language access, right? That's a big thing and a key factor why naturalized citizens remain registered at lower rates. But other obstacles like socioeconomic factors play a role. Working hours, income, we all know that those things are connected to voting. And I think it's also really important to take a racial analysis to the data of newly naturalized voters and native voters, because we know that native-born Americans are more likely to be non-Hispanic whites, while newly naturalized Americans are more likely to be either Hispanic or Asian. And so even when these populations do try to vote, have been frequent reports of these populations being blocked by election administrators at the voter registration process. So, for example, just to pose an example of how difficult this process can be and the different subtle policies and practices that make it more challenging, specifically for our naturalized populations. When we think about the documents that you have to show to prove that you're a citizen, documents like your birth certificate and other documents that prove that you're a native born citizen, you can simply photocopy and mail. Whereas your naturalization document, you must go to the ballot office and show that directly. So that's just one way that naturalized citizens are treated differently. Other subtle kind of practices that happen that really suppress naturalized citizens' ability to vote are just strategic efforts that we see against marginalized communities all the time. But for instance, in the 2004 Texas election, Spanish-speaking volunteers were turned away from helping register people at the polls. So those kinds of things have a huge impact on our naturalized citizens who maybe have language barriers or who have some confusion about the voter registration process or about just the voting process in general, about how to use ballot boxes, that sort of thing. And if there aren't those people who are from their community who are speaking their language, it makes it a lot more difficult for them to access the vote. And so other obstacles are even like voter ID laws and stuff, because we know that foreign-born US citizens are less likely to have driver's licenses. So all of these documentations also pose a sort of poll tax, because to acquire these documents requires going to do that whole process to get a driver's license and paying for your driver's license, et cetera. So yeah, registration to vote is actually one of the biggest barriers for this community. And even once someone who is a newly naturalized citizen is registered to vote, they are still faced with the same voter suppression tactics that we have seen year after year. So for instance, in 2020, there was a really big focus on voter suppression in terms of long wait lines, right, at the polls, because we saw a lot of polling locations being closed. And we know that newly naturalized Americans, especially Latino Americans, tend to have lower incomes and are working longer hours, right? So when you close a polling location in a large Latino community and there's only one polling location and you restrict the voting hours, that's going to have a huge ripple effect on that community and cause lower turnout rates. And even when people do turn out, it causes long lines, which is really discouraging to people who don't have a ton of leisure time, again, to take 10 hours to sit in line and vote. So all of these voter suppression tactics just tack on even more additional obstacles to this population that already faces massive obstacles to, one, becoming a naturalized citizen, and then to even registering to vote. So I think in terms of this population, it's so important to look at voter registration and to have different languages and to really ensure that they're being treated equitably, because they are such a vulnerable population. Yeah, and I think that was most of what I wanted to say, but I'm very excited for questions as well.
Thank you so much, Belen. Certainly a new thought for me about voting rights for people who are living in and contributing as much as any citizen, but people who have not yet received their citizenship. So that's that would be a big step, but it makes a lot of sense. So thanks for illuminating that thought as well as all the others. Appreciate it greatly. Linda's here to talk to us about how local leagues can, on the ground and very specifically, participate in and contribute to the welcoming of new citizens. And she's from Southwest Ohio, Cincinnati. So take it away, Linda.
I'm glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully I'm going to be showing you the happy part of the process. All right. All I need to do is find it here.
And I will remind you all who are on the call, if you have questions, please try to drop them in the Q&A part of the section. I'll look both there and in the chat, but we'll have time for that.
Well, I got involved in helping at naturalization ceremonies because a friend told me about them. I had always had an interest in people from other countries. I lived and taught in Bangkok, Thailand for a year, and I taught in China one summer. And when our church took in refugees from Kosovo and from the Sudan, I was involved with helping them. So it was a perfect fit for me. The League of Women Voters in the Cincinnati area on their website had a wonderful section about how to get involved. And one of them said to help out with naturalization ceremonies. So that got me going there. As was alluded to before by Belen, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services help the people as they go through becoming naturalized citizens. So they have to go through a series of steps, as she mentioned, and they can become naturalized either administratively by the USCIS, which is this Immigration and Immigration Services group, or they can become naturalized at a federal court. And that is what happens here. So Ohio has 2 U.S. District Court regions. The Southern District has courts in 3 cities, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Dayton. And the Northern District has courts in Cleveland, Akron, Toledo, and Youngstown. Now, I went to the League of Women Voters site for Ohio, and I see that we have, I think, 31 chapters around the state. And I went to the websites of those chapters that we have that were in those 7 cities where there are courts to see maybe that's where we could be getting involved. I have to confess that not all the League of Women Voters websites were user-friendly in how you can volunteer to do these things. It appeared to me though, let's see, whoa, I keep clicking on the wrong things here. Are weird things showing up on my screen right now? I can't.
We're looking at the district court map right now.
Okay.
There
All
you go. Okay.
Okay. So the League of Women Voters has chapters near federal courts, as I said, but it didn't look like Akron, Youngstown, or Columbus seemed to be involved in naturalizations. I did not see it on their websites. When I went to the League of Women Voters for Cleveland, I did not see a way to volunteer at naturalizations, but I noticed on a sidebar that they did have a naturalization coming up with their Westlake chapter. So I don't know exactly how you volunteer or if it's word of mouth or what they do. Now, Toledo does naturalization ceremonies, and I found one on their calendar, but I didn't see any way on their website that you could volunteer to help out. So I think there are Cleveland and probably some of you from the surrounding areas, maybe at the end you can help us out with that. Dayton does have naturalizations, but the only way I could find out about them was to do a search on their website. It wasn't clearly there. So I'm wondering if maybe the people in Akron, Youngstown, and the Columbus chapters could maybe find out who helps at the court giving out voter registrations. Is it the court itself that gives out the registrations and collects them and delivers them to the Board of Elections? Or does the Board of Elections come and do that for them there? So I don't know, but hopefully maybe we can find out a way to make that known. The Cincinnati Area League of Women Voters has been involved in naturalizations for about 13 years. Cincinnati is in Hamilton County, and the Board of Elections here used to go to all of the ceremonies and give out and collect the voter registrations. But the court liaison that I work with now told me that the person who was doing that retired. And so about 13 years ago, I'm not sure if they asked the league or we asked them, but we became involved in doing it instead of the Board of Elections. I took over coordinating about 18 months ago, getting the volunteers. There are about 90 volunteers on my list, and many of them have never done any kind of voter registrations before. We work in teams of 4 with one experienced person as the leader. And I have to tell you that not all teams have a weapons sniffing dog on them. I use Sign Up Genius to recruit. And in addition to the 4 people on the team, I mark a slot for a last minute volunteer. And there have been many times when we've had to use that person because there's always some reason at the last minute why someone might have to cancel. I provide the team with written instructions ahead of their date so they know what to expect. And volunteers can also look at videos or PowerPoints that have been provided by our local league or by the state. But often I find that these videos or PowerPoints are not tailored to naturalizations. They are just in general how to vote, how to register voters. So someday I think it would be important for us to make a video just for that purpose. The court selects the venues. Before COVID, many ceremonies were held at the federal courthouse downtown. But from last spring through the fall, the ceremonies were held at the Starlight Drive-In in nearby Claremont County. The soon-to-be citizens drove up and parked as if they were going to watch a movie. And we went from car to car with our masks on, of course, and gave them their voter registrations and other information. They tuned into a certain radio channel on their car and they could listen to the judge speak, and then they got out of their cars when it was time for them to take their oath. They didn't know anything about the pomp and circumstance that some ceremonies have when you go to a federal courtroom to get naturalized. They were just happy that they were becoming citizens. We particularly like the man whose truck displayed his love of his new country. The woman with the flags is our court liaison. Her name is Emily Hiltz. She lets us know when the ceremonies are going to be, how many people to expect, and gives us any last minute instructions that we need. Since the fall, the court began holding ceremonies indoors again. And as in past years, some are held at schools where students get a chance to have a real life lesson in civics. We've had ceremonies at universities. Miami University goes all out with their refreshments. The Glee Club comes and sings. They even give out souvenir cups imprinted with the date of the naturalization and on the back a message from the President, Joe Biden. The Sons of the American Revolution usually show up for ceremonies and they are a big hit. The new citizens love to get their pictures taken with them. Color guards are often there, although sometimes it might be a local police department, or it might even be the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts carrying the colors. And that also adds to the wonder of the ceremony. I think this one was at Mount St. Joseph University in their theater. We even had a naturalization at Great American Ballpark, where the new citizens were greeted on the scoreboard. The only problem was that the game got rained out and they were the only ones in the stadium. It was fun having a ceremony at the Irish Heritage Center. We even let St. Patrick help out, as you can see. The court has held lots of ceremonies at the Masonic Center in downtown Cincinnati. They like it here because the people can spread out and it's a beautiful facility. COVID is still heavy on the mind of the court, and so masks are always required. When this young soldier became a citizen, it was a proud moment for him and all around him because he had been serving his country even before he became an American citizen. The court does not require that we get security clearances, but Zeus, the sniffer dog, comes to all the ceremonies with his federal agent handler to make sure that the area is safe. The handler didn't want to be photographed, but our court liaison did. Our volunteers arrive 2 hours before the ceremony starts to get all the work done that we need. We go around to each person and we have a clipboard, and on the back of it, we hold that up and it says League of Women Voters registering you to vote. This is helpful because some people don't have a good command of spoken English, but sometimes they can read it. So they know why we are there. They know that we are not the court official or someone from USIS asking them questions, but we are just there to get them registered. We give them a registration card and we tell them to fill in the sections that are highlighted. Now, those of you who have registered people before might know that the top of the registration form where it says, I am registering as an Ohio voter, are you a citizen, will you be 18 years of age? Those things are not highlighted on the paper registration forms. So beforehand, we highlight all of them. And then we are able to say to the people, highlight everything that is, or fill in everything that's highlighted in yellow. And we tell them at the bottom where they sign that they need to wait until they've taken their oath. And we often demonstrate that, especially if we think there might be a language problem, by holding up our hands as if we were taking an oath and pointing to that place and saying, don't sign it until you take your oath. We give them a pen that has our local league's phone number, 281-VOTE, and it also has vote411.org on it, and we tell them that that can be a very helpful website. We give them a copy of They Represent Us, True. That's a pamphlet that gives them contact information for federal, state, local officials, and other voting information. We also give them an 8x5 card called Voting in Ohio, Easy as 1, 2, 3. We order these from the Secretary of State's office, and they can also be printed out from a PDF file on the state website. But we like to order the one that comes in because it's nice and shiny and sturdy, and I'm not sure if we pay or if it's free. We probably have to pay, I don't know. The front tells them how to register to vote. And we tell them, this is what we're doing with you today. And then we flip to the back side and we tell them, this is how you can vote. You can vote by mail, you can vote early in person or on election day. We really like this handout from the Secretary of State because it's in simple language and they will likely to make use of it. Some people who are at the ceremonies have interpreters, often a family member, although at different times during COVID, the court was very, very restrictive on how many people could come. And there were not allowed very many interpreters at one point. Right now, I think the situation is much better. Before the ceremony begins, the court allows us to go to the microphone and we go over the registration form out loud, step by step, line by line, and ask them to look at their form and make sure they have filled it in correctly. During the ceremony, the judge introduces us, he gives our names, and he thanks the league for what we do. When the ceremony is finished, we collect the forms as the citizens are leaving. We double check to make sure everything has been filled out correctly. And then we take the registrations to the Board of Elections. Now, I heard in a call a few weeks ago that the Dayton League scans the registrations before turning them into the board so that they can contact new citizens reminding them to vote. We've not done that, but I might look into it. Butler County said that their Board of Election codes the registrations of naturalized citizens in a certain way so that later they can go and they can locate all the people who registered as naturalized citizens and they can contact those people that way. Since April 2021, we have registered nearly 3,000 new citizens to vote in 34 ceremonies. And we have 4 more ceremonies between now and the end of May. It's really been a privilege to be part of this effort, and I hope that more of you can find a way to do that too. So thank you, and we will, all of us, I think, look forward to hearing questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. My own local league is in Athens, so we are kind of a little bit separate from any of these ceremony sites, but it's just lovely to recognize a way that the league can exercise our natural tendency toward hospitality and welcoming for new citizens. So again, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. In the meantime, we don't have a lot of time left, but Tala, could you circle back and tell us a little bit about the Council on American Islamic Relations and the work that you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Council on American Islamic Relations is a big national organization, but they have 35 chapters across the US. And so Ohio is actually one of the larger chapters in the country. And we do a lot to essentially empower the Ohio Muslim community, whether it be through, voter engagement efforts, or through legal advocacy. So we have 3 attorneys on staff to help with discrimination related issues. And it's of course all pro bono, and people come to us with employment-based discrimination issues, with immigration related discrimination issues, and everything really from A to Z, whether it's bullying in school, and just like the inability to navigate a conversation between, parents and school administration. So we do everything, and we also have a youth empowerment aspect to our work, where we build kind of advocacy skills within Muslim youth to help them advocate for their own policy interests, and the policy interests of the community, hopefully in the future. So that doesn't cover everything, but it's certainly a lot of our work.
Thank you so much. Belen, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what is the status of the DACA program right now today, and how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, it's hard to even know what the status is, because it changes so frequently. It's definitely very stressful, I think, for most DACA holders, because it's definitely constantly in flux. And I think this is something that most immigrants who have some sort of status of limbo, whether it's DACA or TPS, or are seeking asylum in this country, are just kind of accustomed to keeping an eye on the news and being vigilant, because the laws are constantly in flux and are constantly changing around what our rights are going to be from a year-to-year basis. DACA is in and out of the Supreme Court. So yeah, it's just a rolling with the punches kind of thing. But I think that DACA youth are incredibly empowered. I think that a lot of them have really planted roots in this country and feel really passionately about this being their home and about keeping that right. So I think that, we've seen a huge rise in undocumented and DACA youth who are now petitioning for pathway to citizenship. And I also feel like that there has been a recent, at least in the DACA community, from my perspective, there has been a recent shifting in the way that we think about immigration and about who is worthy, and about that sort of dichotomy between the good immigrant who deserves rights and the bad immigrant who kind of deserves exclusion and disenfranchisement, and kind of trying to reconcile the fact that actually we are all worthy of rights and of living safe and healthy, happy lives. And that migration is just a very natural aspect of being a human, and it has been for centuries. So I think that there's new shifts in the way that we're looking at DACA, and there's new shifts in the way that we're thinking about what is actually a solution to this problem, and is DACA even a solution? I think a lot of people who are in that boat are kind of seeing DACA as more of a Band-Aid, and are kind of even rejecting the dreamer label at this point. So it's a really interesting time for that community right now. I think it's actually a really, despite the hurdles, I think it's a really empowering time.
Great, thank you. And speaking as a white native born person who didn't have to do anything to achieve my citizenship, I really appreciate the perspective from both of you about what some of our many of our friends and neighbors are experiencing. We have a question from Lynn, and this may be for Linda. What can we do to help new citizens understand what documentation they need to actually vote? You ever thought about that, Linda?
You know, I was just now looking at the Vote 411 website to see, and it's a little, you got to go to step to step to step. We used to give out another set of another handout, but it was unique to Hamilton County, and in it, it did say what they needed to vote, which is true for all the counties. It's the same, but there were so many people, even though they might come to a ceremony in Hamilton County, they come from all surrounding counties. Fewer than half are usually from Hamilton County. So I'm thinking now that that might be a good additional thing. I'm sure we could probably find something for this from the state or make it up that would be just, you know, similar to this form, but would say, here's what you need when it's time to vote.
Okay.
Yeah, that could be something that would be a good project for the league.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I have a very strong sense, which I think is accurate, that we've just skipped off the surface of all it means to be a newly arriving person in the United States, a new citizen, and a league member, a passionate and savvy league member who wants to help in every way that we can. So I'd like to suggest that we have more opportunities to tackle this issue. Please feel free to be in touch with me or Nazik. I'll put my email in the chat. And also, it's pretty clear that we have lots of members from around the state who have experience with this, with the naturalization ceremonies. And we'd love to hear from you. I'm just pleased to be part of the organization that brings this forward. Thank you so much, Tala and Belen and Linda. Really appreciate your time, and as well, all you others on the call. So stay tuned for, we're not sure where we're going next with this series on underserved voters, but we will be in touch. Have a nice day, everybody. Thanks so much.
You.
Thank you.